Hi everyone. Welcome to this latest installment of the Told in Stone Q&A, where I address your questions about the ancient Greeks and Romans. If you have a question about the classical world, ask it in the comments and I'll add it to my list. So, today's first question is, how did the Greeks and Romans look up public records? Is asked by Robert. We ancient historians have archive envy. Modern and even medieval historians had these vast troves they can delve into, troves of documents, which they can cross-reference, explore, and then churn out publications from. What we have in antiquity is pretty much papyri and a lot of memories. We have a few archives preserved in Egypt, the most famous of which is the Zenon archive, the records of a Hellenistic estate manager, which contains his correspondence, his agonies about irrigation, and his general sense of how to manage a large estate in 3rd century BC Egypt. It's all very interesting, but it's not the great political archives we'd want, because those vanished with the great cities of the ancient world, with Alexandria, with Antioch, Rome, and Constantinople. We know that once there were vast archives in Constantinople, beneath the Hippodrome, where, according to John Letus, there were hundreds of crates filled with codices in which several centuries of text records were kept. In Rome, likewise, by the Forum, there are once vast archives containing everything from the Roman equivalent of birth certificates to tax records to legal records, all of which has vanished, leaving only a few lead seals and a lot of, among ancient historians, kind of sour grapes. Now, how were these accessed? To be honest, we don't know. We know they could be accessed because Justin Martyr, an early Christian author, says that those who doubt the existence of the census of Quirinius, the famous phantom census of the New Testament, could look in Caesarea and find the records of that, at that point, century-old census. We don't know, however, how much authorization was required to access these buildings. If you need the governor's permission, if you need a magistrate's okay, or if you just walk in and say, hey, show me that record. So the sad fact is this, like so much else of the classical world, is something of a mystery. Our next question, from Artur de Sousa Roca, is, how do we know what ancient Greek paintings looked like? We have several sources, the most famous of which are the frescoes of Pompeii. Now these, of course, are Roman and date to between the 2nd century BC and the year 79, when Vesuvius blew its top. And they're painted by local workshops of artists who go around frescoing walls, using, we think, pattern books, a series of exemplars of mythological scenes, banqueting scenes, you name it, whose ultimate predecessors, we think, whose exemplars, are some of the great works of Hellenistic and classical painting. So working backward from the scenes we see repeated again and again in the walls of Pompeii and Herculaneum, we can glimpse, at least, famous scenes painted by painters like Apelles. Also, we have mosaics, like the famous Alexander mosaic found at the House of the Faun in Pompeii, which reproduces, we think, a famous painting of Apelles, or one of his contemporaries, showing Alexander at the Battle of Issus, about to spear Darius. And so the sense of drama, of perspective, of verisimilitude captured in that mosaic and the paintings of Pompeii is at least an echo of the great works of classical antiquity. We also have the Fayum mummy portraits, which are very often strikingly realistic paintings of middle-class landholders in Middle Egypt, showing them as they wanted to be remembered, perpetuated on their mummy cases. These are much later, of course, than the works of Apelles and friends, but they capture the spirit, we think, again, that verisimilitude, the verism that the great works of antiquity tried to channel. Then we have, of course, literary references, people like Pliny the Elder talking about these lost masterpieces, which were so realistic, we're told, that people tried to brush away painted flies or pull back painted curtains. Some of these were on display in Rome for many centuries. The emperors and generals brought them back from Greece to the forums, other public places, but they were all destroyed, either overpainted, destroyed by fire, ruined by moisture, all vanished by late antiquity. So all we have from the classical Greek period are the tomb paintings of Macedon, as in places like Vergina, and of course vase paintings, which are quite different from the great panel paintings that we assume were made by men like Apelles, but probably capture at least the general sense and tone. Again, echoes of these lost masterpieces. Question 3 by Joshua Moxham Smith is, did the Romans use candles? We always associate the Greeks and Romans with oil lamps, and that's because oil lamps, of course, were used very widely by both civilizations for many good reasons. Olive oil is pretty cheap and common in the Mediterranean world, and it burns very brightly, almost as brightly as whale oil, actually, as well in the 19th century. So you can illuminate your desk if you're writing or trying to read something, illuminate a dinner party, illuminate a whole large villa if you want. But alongside olive oils, there's still fairly widespread use of tallow candles by the poor of Rome, because candles are cheaper than olive oil, and also in certain ritual contexts, like funerals. According to some Roman authors, in fact, candles are the original mode of illumination in ancient Rome, used before oil lamps. And so they're sort of the ye olde mode of lighting your house, as they are now. So short answer, Joshua, is yes, there were candles, but they were always used alongside oil lamps and were very much the second-rate mode of illumination. Our next question from Ilona Welldale, England is, what jobs could women do in ancient Greece and Rome? Despite their exclusion from the political sphere, which was not total in the case of empresses, but was general, women served many roles in every aspect of classical society. So in the sphere of religion, for example, we have the Vestal Virgins, we have the Pythia at Delphi, we have the Sibyl of Cumae, the priestess at Argos of Hera, many other famous priestesses who serve in at least as prominent capacity as their male counterparts. In medicine, there are female midwives, many of them, attested in inscriptions, even a few female doctors who became quite prominent. In business, we have female fishmongers, female tavern keepers, female clothing merchants. Really, almost every attested occupation has female names linked with it in our inscriptions. Often, even if they weren't the proprietor, women worked alongside their husbands or brothers or even sons in a prominent role as accountants or as general managers in their businesses. In fact, often in an aristocratic household, Roman women kept the accounts. Female slaves served many roles, ranging from hairdresser to shepherdess, to really any role filled by their male counterparts, or almost every role. The most common job for women, of course, besides that of mother, was what we call house management, above all in rural areas, where women work alongside their farmers to keep the farm running, to keep the estate in order. That might go from helping to bring in the harvests, to carding wool, making the family clothing. And so despite their often minimal presence in our ancient sources, women are everywhere in the classical world and filling almost every conceivable job. Our next question, asked by several subscribers, is, what was life like outside the great cities of the classical world? Now, of course, about 9/10 of Greeks and Romans live outside cities, and so their experience varied tremendously. On one end of the social scale, we have the great magnates, the aristocrats, who live a life of leisure in sprawling villas. So we have Pliny, for example, talking about lounging amongst the topiary in his gardens and reading discourses. We have Cicero and his Tusculan disputations talking about philosophical issues with his compatriots. Or we have these wonderful mosaics from North Africa, which show the proprietors of villas doing things like hunting boars and presiding over their tenants as they bring in the harvests. And so far below this life of leisure are the tenants who make it all possible, the hundreds and often thousands of either freeholders and slaves who are subordinate to the great magnates and should do all the hard work. Slaves often live in these huts or in group housing, which is pretty primitive, and spend their days performing all the agricultural tasks required in a villa, from herding goats to managing the orchards, and in a few cases managing the accounts if you're working towards in the great villa itself. Then, of course, between the poles of magnate and slave, we have the small farmers, men like veterans who might have, say, 20 or 40 acres in a frontier district, and will have few slaves or none, perform most of their own labor with their families, and just hire a few agricultural laborers at times of harvest. These men live pretty close to the subsistence level, we think, and most of their most of their profits go to taxes, whether in kind or in coin. But this sort of smallholding is critical to the Roman economy, at least in certain periods, and is very prominent in our sources as well. It's seen as the ideal, in many ways, of the Roman gentleman. And so, in short, life outside the cities of Rome is on a vast spectrum, from the magnate sipping wine and reading Plato to the slave who is forced to labor, in the orchards all day. But certainly an interesting counterpart, in any case, to the urban life that's so prominent in our sources. Our final question, asked by Jacob Creech, is, did the Romans make omelets? Well, we have quite a few sources about ancient food, gourmet food especially. On the archaeological side, we have things like bones, shells, even excavated latrine at Herculaneum, which provides all kinds of fun physical evidence for how Romans ate. But above all, we have literary sources, both stray references and things like the De Sophistae of Athenaeus, a tremendously long and detailed discourse on things like fine dining. We also have a cookbook, the Cookbook of Apicius. Now, the historical Apicius lived in the 1st century AD and was a gourmand of the reign of Tiberius. We have some wonderful anecdotes about him, such as the fact that he once sailed to Libya to find exceptionally large shrimp and then turned back in disgust on finding them undersized. He supposedly went through a massive fortune trying to eat his way through all the culinary delights of antiquity, and finally committed suicide in despair at finding himself unable to supply his groaning table. Now, the historical Apicius had nothing to do with the cookbook that is transmitted under his name. That cookbook comes from the 4th century AD, long after the historical Apicius lived, and is a compendium of elite dishes to serve at banquets, many featuring things like pepper and other fine spices. Now, among the many other dishes in this cookbook is an omelet, which is called just egg sponge with milk. Not too appetizing, but there it is. It's very simple. You just break some eggs into milk, add a bit of olive oil, flip the omelet, and once it's done, douse it with honey and pepper, and then serve to your guests as a dessert. That is the oldest omelet known to us. There's just some Babylonian one that is hiding in the cuneiform somewhere. But yes, Jacob, the Romans did have omelets. So, thank you very much for listening. If you have questions about the Greeks and Romans, ask them in the comments, please, and I will address them as soon as I can. But in the meantime, check out, please, any videos you like on Told in Stone, and thanks very much for watching.